the coronavirus pandemic has put a lot of things in sharp focus, including the often, in fact, almost always conflicting interests of workers and employers. My next guest, coming back to the program, I always enjoy talking with him. Cole Stangler is an independent journalist based in Paris, France, and he recently wrote a piece for the New York Times, headline, How French Workers Took on Amazon in the Middle of a Pandemic, and one subheadline, Yes, It's Possible. So without any further ado, Cole Stangler, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Richard.
It's always good to talk to you. And first of all, tell us what these French workers did. I think people would be very interested.
Yeah, so really what the article kind of walks people through is this conflict that sprung up at the Amazon warehouses in France. France, of course, isn't the biggest market for Amazon, but it does make up about 10% of the company's international revenue. There's 6 of these big Amazon logistics warehouses across France. And when the nationwide lockdown began on March 17th, you had walkouts at these various warehouses across France, led by unions, in which workers were expressing really basic safety concerns. Some didn't want to work at all. Others were raising questions about the availability of really basic things like hand sanitizer, social distancing measures. And obviously the overarching question here is, at the same time as the government's asking people to stay home and to not have gatherings of more than 100 people, why is Amazon telling people, workers, to show up at a warehouse and come to work? Oftentimes these warehouses are employing upwards of hundreds and in some cases thousands of employees. You had walkouts that began then, in which workers expressed these concerns. And what the article really walks through is here that this battle that happened over the Amazon's failure to uphold basic safety obligations at its warehouses. In response to a court ruling, Amazon was essentially limited. Amazon was forced to limit the sales of basically all products that were not essential products. And then under penalty of under a €1 million penalty per day. It's a really massive penalty. And essentially there was an appeals hearing that basically upheld that ruling. And really the end of the day here, before I can see myself talking about all the legal intricacies of it, but really at the end of the day, what the story tries to outline here is essentially how workers, through the protests that I mentioned, through a number of strike actions, through these lawsuits that were brought, essentially forced the company to improve the safety conditions and safety situation at its warehouses. Right now, in response to that court ruling, Amazon has chosen to temporarily suspend activity at all of its warehouses because the company does not want to risk breaking that order that forces it to sell a certain amount of goods. But in the meantime, workers are receiving full pay while they're staying at home. And who knows where this is going to go? Yeah.
Let me just jump in for a second, Cole Stangler. One part of this story that I was trying to understand, and maybe I misinterpreted it, but the way I read it was that the workers, won their victory and then their appeal. Amazon was told, until you come into compliance, you can only ship things that are necessary during the pandemic, whether it's medical supplies or food or whatever. And that Amazon's response was, well, we're not going to ship anything. And I took it as kind of a dick move, for lack of a better interpretation, phrasing on Amazon's part. But maybe it sounds like maybe I was wrong, and maybe they just felt they didn't know how to comply. I mean, I guess.
I think part of the beginning of what you were saying was broken up, so I couldn't fully hear. But I think you're talking about Amazon's decision to close to keep the warehouses shuttered.
Right.
The official reason from Amazon is that it's too complicated, and that might be part of it. That it certainly is complicated to have to decide to separate what goods you can sell under a court order and what goods you can't I think that's part of it. I think even the trade unionists I talked to mentioned that there's certainly some logic there. On the other hand, there was a Bloomberg piece that just came out today, on April 30th, a Bloomberg piece, which I'll pull up right now, talking about potential reasons why Amazon chose to shutter the warehouses, the 6 French warehouses, rather than abide by the court order. And they said that Bloomberg reported that apparently senior Amazon executives were concerned that this order would set a precedent in France, in which other countries would then put pressure on Amazon to say, throughout for as long as we're in this health crisis, you're going to have to sell a certain amount of goods and not sell all of your goods. And Amazon, according to this Bloomberg article, according to Amazon senior executives, in according to a source that was aware of these discussions, Amazon did not want to take that risk. So I think that's probably part of it as well. But in any case, it really shows the extent to which the company was really carefully monitoring this case in France, because either way you look at it, you can look at it from the regulatory point of view, from what are courts going to do in order to crack down on activity that's potentially legal. On the other hand, what are workers going to do? What kind of pressure can workers do to put on Amazon to get it to move on a variety of things? And I think that's another lesson here from France, is that it's through protests and strikes that Amazon was forced to change its behavior.
So it was, I maybe, my instinct might have been at least partially right, that there was a political or a strategic element to Amazon's decision to basically they didn't defy the court order, I guess, but they didn't comply with the idea of they didn't want to comply with the idea of prioritizing vital goods and services during a pandemic.
Sure. Absolutely, and there's maybe another aspect that's important to mention here as well, which is that, and now we're kind of getting into the intricacies of it, of the collective bargaining, but Amazon, a very aggressive employer, a very aggressively anti-union employer in countries where it doesn't have to deal with unions. France, it has no choice, so it has to deal with these unions, although I think there's no question that it would prefer not to. But Amazon has to negotiate, and it makes for a nice kind of card to have if you're Amazon, to say, well, you know what, we haven't officially decided to open up our warehouses again, and as Amazon is forced to negotiate with workers over safety, that kind of looms in the background. Amazon is not, by all, from what everyone can tell from the situation, Amazon is not reconsidering its investment plans in France, but it still hasn't given a firm date of when it's planning to reopen the factories. And again, this shows, I think it's part of the company's bargaining strategy here as well. A very aggressive company.
Well, and again, we're talking with Cole Stangler, independent journalist who writes about labor and economics and other issues. He's based in Paris, France. So, Cole, I guess then when we think about Amazon, trying to strengthen its bargaining position, at least in the context of France, it's bargaining on two fronts, it seems to me. It's collectively bargaining with unions, because it has a unionized workforce there. And I don't know to what extent it's unionized, but it does have to deal with the unions there. And it's also, in a sense, bargaining with the government, or at least playing a game of, a strategic game with the government, trying to hold its ground and maybe force the government to back down a little bit. Is that a correct interpretation of what you're saying, of what you're reporting here?
Amazon wouldn't be putting pressure directly on the French government, because right now it was a court ruling. So the justice system, in principle, in theory, is separate from the government that's in power at any time. So I think, setting that aside, Amazon does also have different obligations to negotiate on both a company-wide level with unions, and then also individually on the site level. And Amazon does not like that. Does not like that very much. And we can get kind of in the weeds here and into inside baseball quickly, and it's sort of boring in some sense. But when you have these different layers of bargaining, what it does is it gives a bargaining and negotiation and dialogue, also just the simple obligations to meet with representatives of workers on a regular basis under the law. What that does on multiple tiers is it gives worker representatives and unions the ability to make demands on Amazon, to put pressure on Amazon. And that's essentially what we're seeing happening here. Amazon says this whole battle isn't really about safety. It's about unions abusing their rights and privileges under the law. And there's no question that unions, to certain companies, especially if you're Amazon, they're sort of a pain in the butt for these companies. They don't want to have to, and they can be annoying too. But that's also part of how collective bargaining works, is that you have to listen to what the other side has to say, and they have the ability to use their rights under the law. And I think what I'm also trying to argue in this piece, rather than get totally bogged down into French collective bargaining, is that if you have a system in which you force the company, a large international company, to sit down with workers on multiple levels, you're making that company more accountable, and you're giving workers more of a voice. And that's kind of what we're seeing playing out here. And I know we're so far away from that kind of scenario in the U.S., but I think it's something to keep in mind. And France, is not a paradise, and there's all kinds of problems and deficiencies with collective bargaining, and employers obviously still exploit workers, but they also have a basic amount of accountability that it's required by the law. And I think that kind of system, a system of mandatory collective bargaining, is what I was trying to hint at, among other things in the article. Is let's start thinking about solutions like that when we're watching companies like Amazon, especially Amazon, we've seen its share price has absolutely skyrocketed during the crisis. Jeff Bezos gaining billions and billions more, and the company looking like it's going to be stronger than ever out of the coronavirus crisis. Let's think about ways to rein this company in, and make it deal with workers and take their concerns seriously.
Well, and that's exactly where I wanted to take this conversation, called Stangler, which is, I was going to say, what if anything are the lessons for the United States in all of this? And to me, it's exactly what you were just driving at, which is, I'm sure I'd say in France, especially, I guess collective bargaining can be annoying, but the least of on my list of concerns about Amazon and corporate power in the United States, annoying the executives is very low on my list of priorities right now. And I would say that as you're saying, and as you're suggesting in this piece, we're seeing wildcat strikes at Amazon warehouses here in the U.S., but there's no organized system of pushing back. Amazon has a long record of abusing its warehouse employees, putting them in unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, 100-degree temperatures, making them run around this place, tracking their movements, just, all kinds of oppressive treatment of employees, mistreatment of employees. And as you say, it's doing better than ever under the pandemic. And possibly driving its employees harder than ever. So anything that might strengthen labor's hand here in the United States strikes me as a good idea. You say, as the battle in France shows, robust legal protections can complement employee activism to improve workers' lives and safety. I would also add that collective bargaining, very often unions will bring to the table public concerns that are in the public interest, and I think, but you tell me, I think that's happened to a certain extent with the collective bargaining with Amazon in France too, but perhaps not. I mean, to me, it's always, if you're insisting on behalf of your workers as a union that they not be exposed to a pandemic virus, you're not just helping the workers, you're helping everybody the workers might run into and pass that virus on to if they get in the workplace. But I guess I'll give you the closing thoughts on this.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think, even if, you can look at what's happened in France, and obviously the legal system is completely different. There's a political culture that's completely different, but there are some even really basic tools that you could take in the U.S. That even exist under the current realm of under the current realm of possibility here, which is look at something like paid sick leave, for example. Compare how Amazon warehouse workers, what the policies are in countries where you have mandatory paid sick leave in France. where those workers who don't feel like they want to come to work, and even in Poland, I've spoken with workers in Poland, which is a huge market for Amazon, in which you have workers at Polish warehouses that are staying at home and they get pay under the law. In the United States, of course, that's not the case. Amazon got a lot of attention in the U.S. for offering unlimited time off from warehouses, but that was unpaid, and shows you how far we are away from that and how far behind the United States is from other countries, even Poland, which is sort of the low cost, a big source of low cost labor in Europe, where a lot of companies outsource to. But a simple measure like extending paid sick leave, paid leave policies in the United States would be a big boost to Amazon workers, and it'd be a boost to of course millions and millions of other workers across the logistics center, across the retail sector, across much of the low wage workforce. It'd be a huge thing. And then if we also look at something like the existing authority that a body like OSHA has. OSHA has the ability to, if it really wanted to crack down on a company that it found was abusing the law and exploiting workers, OSHA also has the ability to ramp up investigations and fines. So there are some measures that you can take in the U.S. that aren't just immediately let's set up European style collective bargaining. I think that maybe a finishing point here, the last point would be the people that are going to know the most about how to tackle Amazon, how to hold Amazon accountable, are going to be the workers that are working in these warehouses across the United States, and those who are going on strike in part, even if it's a small portion of the workforce. On May 1st, it sends a strong signal, and those are the people that know how Amazon fails to uphold its obligations to workers and to the rest of the community. And I think let's just keep that in mind as we see how this plays out, is listen to what the workers who are putting their lives on the line by going to work, and also their professional lives on the line by speaking out against Amazon and going on strike. Because obviously at a non-union employer like that, especially like Amazon, an aggressive anti-worker employer, it takes a lot of courage to walk out into protest,
especially in economic conditions like this. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Cole Stangler, independent journalist based in Paris, France. Great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on this Euro Hour.
Yeah, thanks as always, Richard. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.